If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story. The dying sun painted the long stretch of highway with golden hues as James Harlow drove in silence, his canine partner Hank seated in the passenger seat of the pickup truck. Hank's sharp ears twitched at the occasional rustle of wind or chirp of a bird. The duo had just completed a long day on a classified mission, their bond as handler and dog forged through years of mutual trust and survival. The highway was desolate, cutting through miles of dry brush and empty terrain. James's military instincts never fully switched off. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes catching a cloud of dust rising in the distance. The faint roar of motorcycle engines reached his ears. At first it was distant, but the sound grew louder, reverberating through the quiet evening air. Steel Serpents, James muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The gang was infamous in the region, violent, organized, and ruthless. He had encountered their name before, linked to arms trafficking and other shady operations, but never this close to home. Hank shifted in his seat, sensing James's tension. The roar intensified. James spotted 6 motorcycles closing in behind him, their headlights glaring like predatory eyes in the dusk. He tightened his jaw, trying to keep calm as the bikers fanned out, surrounding his truck like a pack of wolves circling prey. One of them, a burly figure with a jagged scar running down his face, gestured for James to pull over. His leather jacket bore the Steel Serpents emblem, a coiled snake with a gleaming blade for a tail. James slowed the truck, calculating his options. He reached down, instinctively checking the Glock holstered under his seat. The truck rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The bikers dismounted, forming a semicircle around the vehicle. Scarface swaggered up to James's window, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. "Evening, friend," Scarface drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "You're a bit far from town, don't you think?" James rolled the window down halfway, keeping his expression neutral. "Just heading home? Something I can help you with?" Scarface grinned, his yellowed teeth glinting. "Yeah, you can. See, we don't take kindly to strangers snooping around our territory." "I'm not snooping," James replied evenly. "Just passing through." Scarface leaned closer, his breath rancid. "That's so? Then explain why I saw you near our shipment drop last week." James didn't flinch. His mind raced, piecing together what they might know. The mission he'd been on wasn't even related to the Steel Serpents, but their paranoia made it clear they suspected otherwise. Hank let out a low growl, his body coiled and ready. Scarface's grin faltered as his gaze shifted to the dog. "What's with the mutt? He your guard dog or something?" James met his eyes coldly. "He's a lot more than that." The tension snapped like a rubber band. Scarface swung a heavy chain he'd been hiding behind his back, aiming for the truck window. James ducked just in time as the glass shattered. Hank erupted into action, leaping through the broken window and sinking his teeth into Scarface's arm. The biker howled, but the others swarmed in, dragging Hank off and pinning him to the ground. "Don't hurt him," James shouted, leaping out of the truck, but a swift kick to the ribs sent him sprawling. The gang closed in, restraining him, while Scarface, now bleeding and enraged, turned his fury on Hank. The German shepherd struggled against the hands holding him down, his sharp eyes blazing with defiance. Scarface raised the chain again, bringing it down across Hank's flank. The dog let out a pained yelp, but didn't break. He growled low and deep, baring his teeth even as blood matted his fur. James's vision blurred with rage. "Stop! He's just a Scarface sneered. "Oh, he's more than a dog, all right. He's a liability, and liabilities don't live long around here." The gang erupted into cruel laughter, the sound grating against James's ears. He struggled against his captors, but their grip was ironclad. Every strike of the chain on Hank's body felt like a personal blow to James's soul. Scarface crouched down, gripping Hank by the scruff. "You're tough, I'll give you that. But not tough enough." It was then that James noticed one of the bikers fumbling with something in his pocket, a small metallic object. The biker carelessly dropped it on the ground while pulling out a blade. James's sharp eyes locked onto it, a USB drive. The gang didn't seem to notice the slip-up. Their focus remained on tormenting Hank, oblivious to the firestorm building in James's chest. In the chaos, the biker's carelessness became James's opportunity. With a sudden burst of strength, He yanked free from his captors, tackling Scarface to the ground. The gang scrambled, momentarily caught off guard, as James delivered a brutal punch to Scarface's face, knocking him unconscious. "Hank, to me!" James barked. The dog, though injured, mustered the strength to break free and limp to his handler's side. James grabbed the USB drive, shoving it into his pocket as he hoisted Hank into his arms. The bikers regained their bearings, shouting in fury as they closed in. James sprinted to the truck, throwing Hank into the passenger seat before diving into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, gravel spraying as he floored the accelerator. Bullets ricocheted off the truck's frame as the bikers gave chase, their engines roaring like demons in pursuit. James swerved onto a side road, his military instincts kicking in. He knew the terrain better than they did, and with Hank at his side, he wasn't about to lose. But the USB drive in his pocket burned like a brand. Whatever was on it had put a target on his back, and he wasn't about to let the Steel Serpents win. The roar of motorcycle engines still echoed faintly in the distance as James Harlow gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Hank lay slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow but steady. The blood smeared across the dog's fur, and the deep cuts on his flank turned James's stomach. "You're tough, buddy. We're almost there," James muttered, though his words were more of a reassurance for himself than Hank. His focus remained split between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, scanning for headlights. The Steel Serpents wouldn't give up easily, and James knew they were relentless. 20 minutes later, the narrow dirt road gave way to an overgrown driveway. At the end of it stood an old hunting cabin, its wooden frame weathered and leaning slightly from years of disrepair. It wasn't much, but it was a safe house James had used before, a forgotten relic of a past life, stocked with enough supplies to hold out for a while. James killed the engine, stepping out with Hank in his arms. The dog let out a low whine but didn't resist. James kicked the cabin door open and carried Hank inside, gently placing him on a threadbare rug near the fireplace. The safe house smelled of dust and damp wood. Faded hunting trophies adorned the walls, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the dim room. James worked quickly, bolting the door and barricading the windows with wooden planks he had stashed during a previous visit. He didn't bother with the lights. Darkness was his ally tonight. Kneeling beside Hank, James dug into his emergency medical kit. "Let's patch you up," he murmured. Hank's eyes tracked his every movement, his trust unwavering even in pain. James worked methodically, cleaning the dog's wounds and applying bandages. The antiseptic stung, and Hank flinched, but he didn't growl or pull away. "You're tougher than most people I know," James said softly, running a hand over the dog's head. "They don't know who they're messing with." As Hank settled into an uneasy rest, James pulled the USB drive from his pocket, turning it over in his hands. The device was small and unassuming, yet it had caused chaos and nearly cost Hank his life. Whatever was on it, the Steel Serpents wanted it badly, and that meant it was important. James retrieved his laptop from his gear bag, plugging the drive in. He half expected it to be encrypted or corrupted, but a list of files popped up immediately. Most were labeled in cryptic abbreviations, but a few stood out. Routes schedule .xlsx, surveillance pics, and contact/network.pdf. The first file James opened was the schedule. It was a detailed chart of shipment routes, dates, and destinations. Each location was tied to major interstate highways, perfect for smuggling weapons, drugs, and more. James scrolled through, his stomach tightening as he realized the scope of the operation. The Steel Serpents weren't just a biker gang. They were part of a sprawling network of organized crime. Next, he opened the surveillance file. His chest tightened as images loaded onto the screen. They were pictures of him and Hank, taken during past missions. Some were from public areas, a diner parking lot, a gas station, but others were more alarming. One showed him leaving his own apartment, another of Hank in their backyard. "They've been watching us for months," James whispered, anger and unease gnawing at his resolve. His military instincts screamed at him to destroy the drive and go dark, but the deeper part of him, the part committed to justice, knew he couldn't walk away. He had to confront this head-on. The last file, contact/network, was the most chilling. It listed names, positions, and affiliations, local law enforcement officers, politicians, private contractors. Each name was tied to coded notes that James couldn't fully decipher yet. But one name jumped out immediately, Ryan Maddox. James's grip tightened on the laptop. Maddox was a name he hadn't heard in years. They had served together in the military, and for a time, Maddox had been a trusted ally. But rumors of corruption and backdoor deals had followed Maddox after he left the service. Seeing his name here wasn't just a red flag, it was an alarm bell. A low growl from Hank snapped James out of his thoughts. The dog struggled to his feet, his ears perked toward the door. James froze, listening. Faintly over the stillness of the forest, he heard it, the rumble of motorcycle engines. "They found us," James muttered, snapping the laptop shut and grabbing his shotgun. He crouched by the window, peering through the cracks in the wooden planks. Headlights pierced the darkness, growing brighter as the bikes drew closer. Hank limped to James's side, his body tense despite his injuries. "I know, buddy. We've got this," James said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. The cabin was defensible, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Steel Serpents didn't just want to scare him, they wanted blood. The gang's leader, Scarface, dismounted his bike, barking orders to his crew. "Flush him out. Burn the place if you have to, but I want that drive." James's mind raced. He couldn't let the drive fall into their hands, but he also couldn't risk Hank getting caught in the crossfire. He reached under the floorboards, pulling out an old stash of grenades and smoke bombs he'd left behind. "Let's show them what they're up against," James muttered. As the bikers advanced on the cabin, James lit the first smoke bomb and hurled it out the window. The hiss of smoke was followed by shouts of confusion as a thick gray cloud enveloped the gang. James used the distraction to take out two bikers with well-placed shotgun blasts, retreating to cover as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Hank, despite his injuries, stayed close, his growl low and menacing. James reloaded, his eyes darting between the door and the boarded-up windows. He knew the cabin wouldn't hold forever, but he needed to buy time. A Molotov cocktail smashed through a side window, flames licking up the wooden walls. James grabbed a fire extinguisher, dousing the fire before it could spread. The bikers' tactics were escalating, their shouts growing angrier. "You're surrounded, Harlow," Scarface bellowed. "Give it up, or your mutt gets put down for good." James's jaw tightened. He glanced at Hank, whose fierce gaze seemed to say, "We're not done yet." He wasn't going to let them win. Not here. Not tonight. The air inside the cabin was thick with smoke and tension. James knelt behind an overturned table, his shotgun clenched tightly in his hands. Hank crouched beside him, his injured body trembling, but his growl steady and defiant. The roar of engines and the shouts of the Steel Serpents reverberated through the woods, punctuated by the occasional crack of gunfire. James's mind raced. They couldn't hold out much longer. The wooden walls of the cabin were riddled with holes, and the barricades were starting to splinter under the relentless assault. The bikers were closing in, and the faint smell of gasoline hinted that they were preparing for a final push. James glanced at Hank. The dog's ears twitched, his gaze locked on the door, as if he could sense the enemy just beyond. "Hang in there, buddy," James whispered. "We're not going out like this." He reached under the floorboards and pulled out the emergency escape kit he'd stashed years ago. A waterproof satchel, a map of the surrounding woods, and a set of keys to the old dirt bike hidden behind the cabin. It wasn't an ideal plan, but it was their only shot. James grabbed the USB drive and secured it in the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder. He double-checked the shotgun's load and then turned to Hank. "We're making a run for it. Stay close to me." Hank gave a weak but determined bark, his tail wagging faintly. James patted the dog's head and took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The Steel Serpents had regrouped outside, their leader, Scarface, shouting commands. "Tear it down! I want that drive, and I want him alive!" Two bikers armed with crowbars and a sledgehammer began pounding on the cabin door, while others circled the perimeter, their flashlights sweeping through the windows. Scarface held his position near the bikes, his hand resting on the grip of a sawed-off shotgun. Inside, James lit the fuse on a smoke grenade and hurled it toward the front of the cabin. The grenade exploded in a hiss of gray fog, spreading rapidly and shrouding the area in thick smoke. Shouts of confusion erupted from the bikers as James kicked open the back door and bolted into the woods, Hank limping close behind. Gunfire erupted as the gang realized what was happening. Bullets whizzed past James, splintering tree trunks and kicking up dirt. He ducked and weaved through the underbrush, his military training kicking in. Hank struggled to keep up, but his sheer determination kept him moving. "Don't let him get away," Scarface roared, his voice cutting through the case. James reached the hidden dirt bike and yanked the tarp off, his fingers fumbling with the keys as adrenaline surged through his veins. The engine sputtered to life just as the first biker burst through the trees, his weapon raised. James didn't hesitate. He fired a single shotgun blast, hitting the man in the shoulder and sending him sprawling. "Let's go, Hank," he shouted, lifting the dog onto the bike's rear platform. The tires kicked up dirt as James gunned the engine, the bike lurching forward and tearing through the forest. The sound of roaring engines followed close behind, the Steel Serpents in hot pursuit. James swerved around trees and over rocks, the bike jolting violently with every bump. Hank held on tightly, his teeth bared and his ears flat against his head. The bikers closed in, their headlights casting long shadows across the forest floor. James fired blindly behind him, the shotgun's roar mingling with the snarls of the pursuing gang. One biker veered too close and slammed into a tree, but the others pressed on, their determination as fierce as James's. The forest thinned as James approached the edge of a steep cliff overlooking a roaring river. He skidded to a halt, the bike teetering precariously close to the edge. Hank jumped down, his legs trembling, but his spirit unbroken. The Steel Serpents arrived moments later, fanning out in a semicircle to block any escape. Scarface dismounted his bike, his sawed-off shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. "End of the line, Harlow," he sneered. "Hand over the drive, and maybe I'll let you and your mutt live." James stood his ground, his shotgun raised. "You think this ends with me? That drive is already backed up and sent to people who'll tear your whole operation apart." Scarface laughed, his gang joining in. "Nice bluff, but I'm not buying it. You're alone out here, and you're out of options." James's eyes flicked to the edge of the cliff, the rushing water below offering a slim chance of survival. He glanced at Hank, who met his gaze with unwavering trust. "We're never alone," James said, his voice steady. Scarface's smirk faded as James hurled a flashbang grenade into the center of the group. The explosion of light and sound sent the bikers reeling, their shouts of pain and confusion echoing through the forest. James seized the moment, grabbing Hank and sprinting toward the cliff's edge. Without hesitation, James leapt into the void, the wind rushing past him as the river below surged closer. He held Hank tightly, shielding the dog as they hit the water with a bone-jarring splash. The current was strong, pulling James and Hank downstream as they fought to stay afloat. The cold water stung James's skin, but he focused on keeping Hank's head above the surface. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the riverbank, dragging themselves onto the muddy shore. James collapsed onto his back, gasping for air. Hank lay beside him, his chest heaving, but his eyes still alert. "We made it," James whispered, though he knew this was only a temporary victory. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, James surveyed their surroundings. They were miles from the nearest road, deep in the wilderness. The Steel Serpents wouldn't stop hunting them, and James had no doubt Scarface would regroup and strike again. But for now, they were alive. And as James looked at Hank, battered but unyielding, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Together, they would face whatever came next. James sat on the muddy riverbank, wringing water out of his jacket while Hank lay beside him, his injured body still but his eyes watchful. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, casting a golden light on their surroundings. James's mind was racing. They'd escaped death for now, but the Steel Serpents weren't the kind of enemy to let go. Scarface and his gang would hunt them down, and James had no intention of waiting for the next ambush. "We can't keep running, Hank," James murmured, his voice grim but resolute. "If we want to survive, we have to take the fight to them." Hank let out a soft bark as if agreeing. Despite his battered condition, the German shepherd's loyalty and determination remained unshaken. James patted his partner's head and stood up, his gaze hardening as he made a plan. The USB drive in James's pocket held the key to the Steel Serpent's operations. shipment routes, corrupt contacts, and locations of their hideouts. He needed to act quickly, using this information to dismantle their operation before they could regroup. But first he needed supplies, reinforcements, and a safe place to stage his counterattack. James knew of a small town a few miles upriver. Nestled in the hills, it was home to a retired ally, Mark Grizzly Taylor, a former military comrade who now ran a small hunting lodge. Grizzly was a man of few words, but had a reputation for loyalty and resourcefulness, exactly what James needed right now. After hours of trudging through the dense forest, James and Hank arrived at the lodge, a rustic wooden building surrounded by towering pines. The faint smell of wood smoke wafted through the air as Grizzly stepped out onto the porch, his hulking frame silhouetted against the rising sun. "Well, I'll be damned," Grizzly drawled, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted James and Hank. "You look like you've been through hell." "Not just me," James replied, gesturing to Hank. "We need your help, Grizz. The Steel Serpents are after us, and it's bigger than just them." Grizzly's expression darkened at the mention of the gang. He'd heard rumors of their activities, but had no idea how deep their network ran. Without hesitation, he stepped aside, ushering James and Hank inside. The lodge was cozy but well-equipped. Mounted animal heads adorned the walls, and a large map of the surrounding area was pinned above the fireplace. Grizzly wasted no time tending to Hank's wounds, his gruff demeanor softening as he worked on the loyal dog. "You've got guts coming here," Grizzly said as he wrapped a fresh bandage around Hank's leg. "But if you're looking to go after them, you'll need more than guts." James pulled out the USB drive and slid it across the table. "This has everything. Shipment routes, contacts, hideouts. If we hit them where it hurts, we can take them down for good." Grizzly studied the drive, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right, I'm in. But we'll need to be smart about this. Those bastards don't play fair." The next few hours were a blur of planning and preparation. Grizzly's lodge turned into a makeshift war room as James and Grizzly pored over the data on the USB drive. The Steel Serpents' main hideout was located in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a nearby city, a hub for their smuggling and trafficking operations. Taking it down would deal a significant blow to their network. "We hit the warehouse first," James said, tracing the route on the map. "But we'll need to disable their communications to keep them from calling for backup." Grizzly nodded. "There's a radio tower here," he said, pointing to a location a few miles from the warehouse. "Take that out, and they'll be blind." "And after that?" Grizzly asked. James's eyes hardened. "We finish it. Scarface and his crew won't stop until they're dealt with permanently." As night fell, James and Grizzly prepared for their first strike. Armed with rifles, silencers, and a satchel of explosives, they trekked through the forest toward the radio tower. Hank, though still injured, insisted on accompanying them, his sharp instincts a vital asset. The tower was guarded by 3 bikers, their silhouettes visible in the moonlight. James signaled for Grizzly to take the left flank while he approached from the right. Hank stayed low, his body tense as he waited for the signal. In perfect synchronization, James and Grizzly took out the guards with silenced shots, their bodies crumpling to the ground without a sound. James planted explosives at the base of the tower, setting a timed fuse. "Let's move," he whispered, and the trio disappeared into the shadows just as the tower erupted in a fiery explosion. The sound echoed through the valley, cutting off the Steel Serpents' communications and sending them into disarray. With the radio tower down, James and Grizzly turned their attention to the warehouse. The Steel Serpents had fortified the building, armed guards patrolling the perimeter and vehicles parked haphazardly outside. The gang's arrogance was evident. They believed no one could challenge them. James and Grizzly moved under the cover of darkness, disabling guards one by one. Hank, despite his injuries, played a crucial role, sniffing out hidden sentries and alerting James to their positions. Inside the warehouse, the scope of the Steel Serpents operation became clear. Crates of weapons, drugs, and cash were stacked to the ceiling, and a group of men sat around a table, counting money and reviewing shipment logs. Scarface was there, his presence commanding as he barked orders to his crew. James's grip on his weapon tightened. This was their chance to end it. Grizzly set charges around the warehouse, while James positioned himself for the final confrontation. As the last charge was set, James stepped into the open, his shotgun aimed directly at Scarface. "It's over," James said, his voice cold and steady. Call off your men. Scarface's eyes widened in shock, but it quickly morphed into a sneer. You've got guts, Harlow. Too bad you're outnumbered. The sound of gunfire erupted as Scarface's men opened fire. James and Grizzly ducked behind cover, returning shots with deadly precision. Hank leapt into the fray, taking down a guard who had flanked them. The battle was chaotic, the air thick with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. One by one, Scarface's men fell, until only the gang leader remained. Bloodied but defiant, Scarface charged at James with a knife. James sidestepped the attack, delivering a brutal blow that sent Scarface crashing to the ground. He stood over the gang leader, his weapon trained on him. It's over, James repeated. The Steel Serpents are finished. Scarface spat blood, his defiance unwavering. You think this ends with me? You have no idea how deep this goes. James and Grizzly loaded the USB drive and evidence from the warehouse into a truck, ensuring it would reach the authorities. Scarface was left tied up for the police, his reign of terror finally over. As they drove away, James glanced at Hank, who rested in the back seat, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. The fight wasn't just about survival. It was about justice, about standing up against the darkness and proving that loyalty and courage could triumph over even the most insurmountable odds. For James and Hank, this was just the beginning. The Steel Serpents might be dismantled, but the network they were a part of still loomed large. And as long as there was injustice in the world, they would keep fighting. Let me know if you'd like to continue or explore additional elements of this thrilling narrative. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. The sun rose slowly over the smoldering remains of the Steel Serpents warehouse, casting a grim light on the consequences of James and Grizzly's daring raid. The sounds of distant sirens confirmed that the authorities were closing in to apprehend Scarface and his remaining crew. For James, however, there was no time to celebrate. He and Hank had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg, and the fight against the network of corruption and crime was far from over. As James, Grizzly, and Hank regrouped at the lodge, James connected the USB drive to his laptop once more. The files they had found earlier hinted at something far larger than the Steel Serpents, a sprawling web of illegal activity involving not only rival gangs, but also politicians, law enforcement, and private contractors. One file stood out, a dossier labeled Operation Iron Veil. The document detailed plans for a massive weapons shipment set to move through several cities within days. It also implicated Ryan Maddox, the ex-military operative whose betrayal still weighed heavily on James. Maddox wasn't just involved, he was orchestrating the operation. This goes all the way to the top, James muttered, scrolling through the documents. Maddox has turned this into a full-blown criminal empire. Grizzly leaned over, his brow furrowed. We've hit the Serpents hard. But Maddox is going to retaliate. He won't let you walk away from this. That's why we're not walking away, James replied, his eyes blazing with determination. We're going to bring this whole operation crashing down. Though Hank's injuries were severe, the loyal German shepherd showed remarkable resilience. Grizzly, ever the resourceful ally, used his knowledge of canine first aid to help Hank recover more quickly. Despite his pain, Hank remained steadfast, shadowing James wherever he went. During their downtime, James doubled down on Hank's training, knowing the battles ahead would demand every ounce of their combined strength. Grizzly watched in quiet admiration as the bond between man and dog deepened. You've got one hell of a partner there, Grizzly said, tossing Hank a treat after a particularly grueling session. Most men would have folded by now, but not him. James nodded, crouching beside Hank and scratching behind his ears. He's more than a partner. He's family. With the details from the USB drive, James and Grizzly mapped out the next phase of their mission. The key target was a high-security compound on the outskirts of a neighboring city where the weapons shipment was being stored. Taking it down would cripple Maddox's operation and cut off a vital revenue stream for the network. The journey to the compound was fraught with danger. Maddox had placed bounties on James and Hank, and every outlaw and hired gun in the region seemed eager to collect. Along the way, James and Grizzly were ambushed multiple times, forcing them to rely on their wits and combat skills to survive. One particularly brutal encounter occurred at an abandoned gas station. As James and Grizzly stopped to refuel and rest, A convoy of heavily armed bikers surrounded them. Outnumbered and outgunned, the duo set up an ambush of their own, using the station's narrow corridors and concealed exits to pick off their attackers one by one. Hank, now fully recovered, proved invaluable during the skirmish. His keen senses and fearless demeanor allowed him to take down two assailants, saving James from an ambush. By the time the dust settled, the gas station was in ruins, but James, Grizzly, and Hank emerged victorious. Arriving at the compound under the cover of darkness, James and Grizzly conducted reconnaissance to assess its defenses. Maddox wasn't taking any chances. The facility was surrounded by armed guards, surveillance cameras, and a series of fortified gates. "We're not walking in through the front door," Grizzly remarked, peering through binoculars. "We'll need a distraction." James formulated a plan. Grizzly would create case at the compound's eastern perimeter, while James and Hank infiltrated through a maintenance tunnel on the western side. The goal was to reach the storage area, disable the shipment, and extract any additional evidence linking Maddox to the operation. The plan went into motion with precision. Grizzly's explosives rocked the eastern side of the compound, drawing guards away from their posts. James and Hank slipped through the maintenance tunnel, navigating narrow passageways until they reached the heart of the facility. Inside, they found rows of crates filled with weapons, ammunition, and illicit goods. James quickly planted charges on the largest shipments, setting timers to ensure a synchronized detonation. As they worked, Hank alerted James to approaching footsteps. Guards were closing in. The ensuing firefight was intense. James used the facility's layout to his advantage, picking off guards from the shadows while Hank flanked their positions. The dog's training and instincts were unmatched, and together they neutralized the threat. With the charges set and evidence secured, James and Hank retreated toward the extraction point. As they exited the facility, a series of explosions rocked the compound, lighting up the night sky and leaving Maddox's operation in shambles. The victory at the compound came at a cost. Maddox, furious at the loss of his shipment, launched a counteroffensive. He deployed his most loyal operatives to hunt James and Hank, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. One such encounter occurred at a remote motel where James and Grizzly had stopped to regroup. Maddox's men stormed the building, forcing a brutal showdown that left the motel in ruins. Though James and Hank managed to escape, the relentless pursuit took its toll. As they evaded Maddox's forces, James began piecing together a plan to confront his former ally directly. The USB drive contained encrypted messages hinting at Maddox's location, a secluded estate hidden deep in the mountains. It was there that James planned to end the fight once and for all. The journey to Maddox's estate was treacherous. The mountainous terrain provided ample opportunities for ambushes, and Maddox's men exploited every advantage. Despite the challenges, James and Hank pressed on, their resolve unshaken. Arriving at the estate, James and Grizzly prepared for the final battle. The sprawling property was heavily guarded, with watchtowers, patrols, and booby traps scattered throughout. Every step forward was a calculated risk, but James's determination never wavered. The final confrontation with Maddox was a brutal clash of wills. Maddox, ever the tactician, used every resource at his disposal to gain the upper hand. But James's training, coupled with Hank's unyielding loyalty, proved too much for the rogue operative. In the end, Maddox fell, his empire crumbling around him. As the authorities moved in to secure the estate, James and Hank stood together, battered but victorious. The fight had been long and harrowing, but justice had prevailed. Back at Grizzly's lodge, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The fight against the Steel Serpents and Maddox's network had tested every limit, but it had also reaffirmed the unbreakable bond between man and dog. Hank, now fully recovered, rested at James's feet, his eyes filled with trust and loyalty. Together they had faced unimaginable odds and emerged stronger. As James prepared to share the evidence with federal authorities, he knew the fight against injustice wasn't over. But with Hank by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The story of James and Hank wasn't just one of survival, it was a testament to courage, loyalty, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Together they had proven that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way, you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.